Devlog 3. This week I started by making a new piece of cardboard UI. I decided I'm going to make some buffs and debuffs for the character, the type that will be active when cards are used or when traps are set off. I'm making this to create a visual representation of how the different effects will be on the character. So I made 3 different UI elements. One for buffs, debuffs, and healing effects, none of which have been implemented into the game so far, but that comes next. The first one that I wanted to make was a poison debuff that'll damage the characters on the start of their turn based on a percentage of their health. Then I made what I'm calling a winded debuff. This one will make attacks cost more stamina. The next step was to visually align them in the game on the character screen. All the UI elements that are similar to the ones I just made should line up from top to bottom on the right side of the character screen. Now it's time to actually implement one of these debuffs. The winded debuff is unique in that it will automatically be applied to the character after their first attack of that turn. I'm designing it this way so that no matter how the player chooses to build their character, they should be able to reasonably get off an attack each turn. But there would be penalties if they choose to attack more than one time per turn. Each buff and debuff will have a duration that counts down at the start of that character's turn, and every time it counts down, the effect will be applied to the character, whether good or bad. Once the timer reaches 0, the buff or debuff is removed. Next up was the poison debuff. If I give the character a few turns worth of poison, you can see that it applies this really crummy particle effect, and the debuff now visually shows on the character. And like I was saying before, at the start of his turn, he'll take damage based on a percentage of his max health. Next it was time to make the card designs for these. I started by making this green card to represent the healing items. Then I made a red one to represent the debuffs, or negative effects that would be placed on characters. Lastly, I made this blue one that would represent positive effects or buffs that would go on the character. And then I made new tabs in the deck builder that would show each of these cards. I planned to have a lot of each type, so it only made sense to separate them. The system I made for this is pretty much automatic, so I don't even have to put a lot of work in to add new cards. The only difficulty is designing the template card that all the other cards will be based off of, which I just showed. Soon enough, I had a new poison card in my deck to play around with. It works pretty much as you'd expect. You drag it and drop it over a character and it applies poison. The duration of the debuff is specified on the card. Right now I'm making buffs and debuffs stackable, so you could apply 2 of these poison cards and double the effect. However, it only extends the debuff. It doesn't actually make the debuff do anything else, or increase the potency of it or anything. Not long after that, I had 2 new types of healing cards as well. The first one is just an instant heal. This will immediately heal the character based on the specified amount. The other type of healing card is one that applies a healing buff, one that I'm calling continuous heal. This essentially works as the opposite of a poison debuff. It heals the character at the start of every turn, based on a percentage of their health. I coded it so that any heal effects take place before any negative health drop effects. This way the character won't die to something like poison damage, even if they have a heal going. Then I had to make a better visual representation for heals. A common video game cliche is using food as healing items, and in this particular case I think it works well. So I started by making this slab of meat to represent the instant heal, and then I went on to make this drawing of broccoli to represent the long-lasting heal, because you know, broccoli's good for you. It's good for your health or something, I don't know. And just like that, the new cards are looking a lot better. The new images make it easy to tell what you have in your hand. Now it was time to make the first buff card. I'm starting with something simple and making a crit rate up card, or a card that applies a buff to increase your crit rate. This one was a little bit harder to implement because I had to figure out some maths behind the scene and how to make it work with the equipment pieces that also affect the crit rate. And as a card design, I just made this target. And like everything else before, I just added it to a card. And now we've got a new working crit rate buff card. One that'll give the character a nice little boost in crit rate when they need it. Then I had to focus a lot of time on a problem that I had. That being how the equipment pieces work. See, how they worked in the game to this point is all equipment pieces, no matter what slot they were designed up based off of the same script. And while this worked fine, it wasn't good by any means, and it didn't really allow me to do anything else. And it led to a lot of the scripts kind of getting in each other's way. Like how a helmet would still have all the variables that I needed to ignore for a weapon or something. So ultimately I found it would have just been better to separate all the items into their own pieces. This required a lot of work from me, probably about 5 hours worth. Essentially what I had to do was I had to take the hundreds of lines of code that I had written for equipment pieces and separate them into 5 times that amount. Ultimately the game will still function the same, but it allows for more options as a developer. For example, now I can add something like fire damage to a weapon without having to worry about how it affects all the other scripts. Next on the agenda is something I've wanted to add for a while, a discard system. Because currently when you use a card, all it does is just destroy it and doesn't do anything else with it. So I made this little discard UI that certain cards will go to after they're used. And if you have a card in your hand that you feel like you're not going to use and it's just taking up a spot, you can click and drag it, and place it in the discard pile. The next step was to make sure the discard pile shuffled into the deck. This should be automatic so that when the player has no more cards in their draw pile, the discard pile automatically shuffles all cards in there at random. And then I had to make sure that all the newly shuffled cards can still go into your hand properly, which as you can see, definitely happened. Looking back, I still have no idea what caused this ridiculous bug. I thought everything looked fine in the code, but I guess not. Sometimes I just don't understand your Unity engine. The solution was, I don't even know. I felt like I kinda just deleted things at random until it worked. So I don't know what caused it, and I don't know what fixed it, but it works. So I'm just gonna move on. For the last piece of this puzzle, I just had to figure out a way to remove the equipment pieces that are already equipped on the characters, and somehow turn those equipment pieces into new cards that would go to the discard pile. So I started by making this little X that would go on each character slot, and when the player clicks it, it should create a new card based on the equipment piece, and throw that card into the discard pile. And with that working, now all individual pieces of a character can be removed. I wanted to add this feature to give the player more options. This way, if the player comes up with a new strategy or wants to make a new character build on the fly, they can now remove pieces and get those cards back to use later. The next step in this was to apply the same logic in swapping equipment pieces. So if the character equips a new piece over a slot that already has a piece, it'll do the same thing and create a new card and throw that in the discard pile. The final thing I had to do was make sure that all the values on the character screen were read correctly, meaning that if you were going to remove a piece or swap it, you should know exactly how it's going to affect your character's stats. So I had to add a lot of code to calculate the changes. And that concludes all the work I've done up to this point. It was a pretty productive week in my opinion. As usual, if you watched the video and stuck around this far, thanks for watching. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.